Hollow Tides of the Drowned God. Chapter 9. The God in the Claw. The hideout stank of victory. To Grendel Brekker, it smelled like ozone-scorched circuits and the sharp mineral tang of freshly printed jewel chits. To Jorin, it was the smell of a tomb being furnished. Piles of salvaged med packs, ration bars stamped with the Spire's own pristine logo, and a half-dozen forbidden real sun vitamin D injectors lay strewn across a rust-pocked steel table. They were the spoils of a ghost's work, his work. Grendel hefted a heavy, salvaged hydraulic claw, its joints weeping a thin black lubricant. He grinned, his teeth a collection of mismatched salvage, some ivory, some steel. Look at it, Jorin, look. The Tide Lords haven't eaten this well since ever. He let out a booming laugh that seemed to shake the condensation loose from the pipes overhead. A single fat drop of briny water fell, landing with a soft hiss on a glowing orange work lamp. And it's all thanks to you, my golden goose. Jorin didn't look at the spoils. He was staring at the wall, at a patch of phosphorescent fungi that pulsed with a sickly green-gold light. The whispers in his head were agitated tonight, a frantic, overlapping chorus. It was always worse when emotions ran high in the Sump. The district's collective anxiety was a current, and he was a broken antenna picking up every scrap of static. He could feel the greed radiating from Grendel, the fear from the 1,000 souls crammed into the containers around them. It was a pressure building behind his eyes. Can't breathe. The water, so cold. A voice, not his daughter's. A man's, thin and reedy. Jorin flinched, pressing the heel of his palm against his temple. Grendel's smile tightened, the humor in his eyes dimming. Don't go drifting on me now, Goose. This is the celebration. He gestured with the claw toward the pile of chits. This is just the start. Praxilla's compliance goons are running in circles, patching leaks that are already yesterday's news. By the time they figure out how we're doing it, we'll own every valve and junction from here to the Whispering Gills. You are a fool, Grendel.
The voice was quiet, yet it cut through Grendel's bombast like a shard of ice. Hestian stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the flickering blue neon of the corridor beyond. She was thin, her Sump rat rags hanging off a frame that seemed too fragile for the Sump's brutal gravity. But her eyes, luminous in the dim light, held an unnerving stillness. She stepped inside, the metal door groaning shut behind her. Hestian. Grendel's tone was thick with condescension. Come to read the rest patterns for us. Tell us our fortunes. She ignored him, her gaze finding Jorin. He could feel her attention like a physical touch, a cool hand on his fevered mind. For a moment, the whispers receded, frightened by her presence. The pressure is wrong, she said, her voice barely a murmur. The city, it's holding its breath. Jorin knew exactly what she meant. He felt it too. It wasn't just the groans of the hull, the familiar song of Amphitrite's agony. This was something new, a deep, resonant tension, as if a colossal spring was being wound tighter and tighter somewhere in the abyss below. Grendel scoffed, slamming the hydraulic claw down on the table. The chits jumped. Rust rot. The pressure is always wrong. That's life in the bucket. What's different now? You are, Hestian said, her eyes not leaving Jorin. You're using him like a hammer, and you're hitting the hull. You think no one notices? You think the ones in the Spire are the only ones listening? I don't care who's listening. Grendel's voice rose, losing its jovial edge and taking on the hard, brutal tone of the Tide Lord. Let them listen. They hear the sound of the Sump taking its share. For decades we've clung to the hull, eating nutrient paste and breathing rust, while they simulate sunlight. Now we have a weapon, an advantage. He jabbed a finger toward Jorin, who was now clutching his head with both hands. The argument was a spike of pure, focused emotion. The whispers surged back, no longer just voices, but images, feelings. A flash of cold, crushing blackness, the taste of salt and blood, the panic of lungs filling with water.
A woman's voice this time, desperate. He saw a flash of a small hand, not his daughter's, pulling away in the dark water. The memory was so vivid, the grief so sharp, it felt like his own. He gasped, stumbling back a step. "You see?" Hestian's voice was urgent, a low hiss. "You're agitating it. All this noise, this greed. The echo feeds on it. You're making him a beacon." "He's a tool," Grendel roared, his patience finally snapping. "A rust-rotted, half-mad tool that I picked out of the gutter, and I will use him." He took a menacing step towards Jorin. "He just needs to be reminded who keeps him safe, who feeds him." Jorin looked up, his eyes wide with a pain Grendel couldn't possibly understand. He saw the Tide Lord's face contorted with rage, but behind it he saw the faces of the drowned, a dozen, then 100, their features blurring together in a silent, screaming chorus. They were looking at Grendel with an ancient, predatory hunger. The air in the room grew thick, heavy. The constant thrum of the geothermal turbines seemed to deepen, dropping an octave. The green-gold fungi on the wall pulsed faster, its light casting long, dancing shadows. Hestian took an involuntary step back, her hand flying to the small biomineralized charm around her neck. "Grendel, stop," she breathed. "You don't know what you're doing." But Grendel was too lost in his triumph, in his righteous fury. He saw Jorin's weakness, his trembling, as an insult. He saw Hestian's fear as superstition. "He's my golden goose," Grendel repeated, his voice dropping to a low growl, "and it's time he laid another egg." He reached for Jorin. The uneasy tension in the room curdled into something else, something cold and ancient. Jorin didn't see Grendel anymore. He saw a man standing on a precipice, celebrating his wealth, utterly blind to the abyss that was opening up to swallow him whole. And from the depths of that abyss, inside Jorin's own skull, the whispers stopped their frantic pleading. They united, and they watched.
The Sump Central Concourse breathed its usual labored breath. The air, thick with the tang of ozone from a sputtering junction box and the damp metal scent of perpetual rust, moved sluggishly between the gantries and repurposed cargo containers. Below Jorin's feet, the deck plates hummed with the city's deep-frequency heartbeat, the ceaseless thrum of the geothermal turbines far below. It was a sound he once found comforting, the pulse of their shared survival. Now it was just another layer of noise in a mind already screaming. He kept his head down, shoulders hunched inside his worn welder's jacket, trying to be just another face in the tired river of humanity. Workers in grease-stained coveralls shuffled past, their eyes glazed with the familiar exhaustion of a double shift. A line snaked from the nutrient paste dispenser, a silent, grim procession waiting for their bland allotment of jeweled chitch. The only vibrant colors in this world of rust and shadow were the sickly orange of sodium work lamps and the ghostly blue of a flickering neon sign advertising Tide Lord Salvage.
Grendel's arrogant brand burned into the concourse's main wall. He could feel the whispers of the echo today, a low tide in the back of his skull. Not his daughter's voice, not Ilara. These were strangers, a frantic prayer in a language he didn't know, the taste of salt and diesel on his tongue, the phantom sensation of cold water rising past his ankles. He pushed it down, focusing on the mundane. The drip, drip, drip of condensation from an overhead pipe into a rust-colored puddle. The scrape of a maintenance drone's metallic claws against a bulkhead. Anything to anchor him in the here and now. Anything to keep from drowning in the there and then. Then the sound came. It wasn't the familiar, almost gentle chime of a shift change, nor the sharp shriek of pressure-stressed metal that everyone had learned to ignore. This was a sound that tore through the fabric of the concourse, a deep, guttural, two-tone klaxon. Bwomp, bwomp. It was a sound no one had heard in a generation. A sound from the city's darkest historical logs, a sound that meant something had broken beyond repair.
Every head snapped up. The nutrient cue dissolved. Conversations died in throats. The maintenance drone froze in place, its single red optic swiveling wildly. The klaxon vibrated up through Jorin's boots, a physical assault that made the fillings in his teeth ache. In his head, the whispers of the echo erupted into a terrified shriek, a chorus of 100 drowning moments triggered by the alarm. And then the lights changed. The sickly orange and muted blues were violently extinguished, plunged into a half-second of absolute blackness. They were replaced by the stroking rhythmic pulse of emergency reds. Every surface, every face was thrown into a hellish relief of crimson and shadow, blinking in and out of existence. The concourse looked like the inside of a failing, monstrous heart. A crackle of static, and then a voice. It boomed from every voxcaster in the Sump, sharp-edged and utterly devoid of emotion. Praxilla Var. Attention, all residents of the Sump districts, levels 1 through 12. By the authority of the Tri-Arch Council, and under the provisions of the Hull Integrity Act, Emergency Protocol Scylla is now in effect. Confusion was the first wave. People looked at each other, their faces painted in strobing red, searching for an explanation. A drill? A mistake? The words were sterile, bureaucratic, but the klaxon told a different story. It was the song of the abyss itself, come to claim them. A catastrophic biostructural compromise has been confirmed. Praxilla's voice continued, cold as the water outside the hull. The Sump district is the designated point of origin. To ensure the survival of Amphitrite, the whole must be protected from the compromised part. Jorin felt a cold dread clamp down on him, colder than any deep-sea dive. Biostructural compromise. It was her term for the echo, for him. The crowd began to stir, the confusion curdling. "What does that mean?" a woman shouted, clutching a child to her leg. "Compromised how?" Praxilla's voice answered as if the woman hadn't spoken. "All vertical and horizontal transit between the Sump and the mid-Spire levels is now terminated. Effective immediately. This quarantine is absolute and permanent." Permanent. The word hung in the red pulsing air, a death sentence. It was the spark that lit the fuse.
A collective gasp rippled through the concourse, followed by a low murmur that quickly escalated into a roar of disbelief and fury. Permanent, entombed. Then came a new sound, deeper and more terrible than the klaxon. A low, grinding groan that shook the entire concourse. It wasn't the familiar groan of a settling arcology. It was the sound of immense, ancient machinery reluctantly coming to life. From the ceiling, where the main transit shafts led up toward the mid-spire and the promise of cleaner air, massive slabs of reinforced durasteel began to descend. 10 meters thick, their surfaces scarred with decades of pressure, the primary quarantine bulkheads were closing. The panic became a physical thing, a stampede. The roar of disbelief turned to screams of raw terror. "To the shafts!" someone bellowed, and the crowd surged as one entity toward the closing transit gates. They were a torrent of bodies, a human flood of desperation. Jorin was swept up in it, his feet barely touching the deck as the mass of people carried him forward. A man tripped and was instantly trampled, his cry cut short. Jorin fought against the current, pressing himself into an alcove behind a pillar of tangled pipes. He wasn't trying to escape. Where would he go? Up level into Praxilla's waiting arms? He was a fugitive in the Sump, and now the Sump was a cage for them all. He watched the horror unfold. The massive bulkhead descended with agonizing slowness, indifferent to the chaos below. People scrambled, clawed at each other, trying to squeeze through the shrinking gap. The klaxon wailed on, the rhythm of their doom. The grinding grew louder, the vibrations more violent. Bioluminescent fungi on the walls pulsed erratically with the strobing red lights, their ghostly green-gold light a sickening counterpoint to the emergency. The air grew thick with the smell of sweat and fear, a primal odor that overpowered the ozone and rust. With a final earth-shaking clang, the first bulkhead slammed shut. The sound was absolute, a note of finality that echoed through the bones of every person trapped below. It was the sound of a tomb being sealed. Seconds later, another, and then another, each impact a hammer blow against hope. The grinding stopped. The klaxon cut out. The red lights continued their silent, frantic pulse. Silence descended. A new and terrible kind of silence, broken only by the weeping of those who had stopped running and the ragged, panicked gasps of those who now stood staring at the unmoving walls of their prison. They were cut off. From the Spire, from the Council, from everything. Praxilla's voice returned, one last time, even colder now in the relative quiet. The hall is the whole. Survival is mandatory, deep and safe. The Voxcaster clicked off. The message was clear. You will survive in your cage, or you will die in it, but you will not threaten the rest of us. The city's deep thrum felt distant now, muffled, the heartbeat of a world they no longer belonged to. Grendel Brekker, Tidal Lord and self-proclaimed King of the Sump, raised a dented chrome cup. The liquid inside, a luxury of illicitly distilled fungus ale, sloshed precariously. His hideout, a repurposed ballast control room, was a chaotic throne room of salvaged tech and blinking unauthorized monitors. Wires hung like metallic lianas from the ceiling, their frayed ends sparking with the faint, sharp scent of ozone. "To Praxilla Var and her compliance cronies!" Grendel roared, his voice echoing off the curved, weeping bulkheads. His men, a motley crew of mechanics and scavengers, cheered raggedly. "May they rust in the Spire while we build an empire in the deep!" Jorin didn't join in. He sat apart on a stacked crate, nursing a bulb of recycled water, the plastic slick with condensation. The noise of the celebration was a thin film over the deeper sounds that lived in his head. The gentle lapping water, the whispered name of his daughter, Ilara. He tried to focus on the room, on the sickly orange glow of the work lamps and the ghostly green of the glimmer moss cultivated in a cracked aquarium. But the whispers were persistent. Beside him, Hestian sat cross-legged, their eyes closed. The Sump rat mystic was a pool of stillness in Grendel's loud churning pond, seemingly oblivious to the gloating. It began without warning. Not a sound at first, but a vibration. A deep, resonant thrum that wasn't the familiar groan of the city. It came up through the soles of Jorin's boots, a low-frequency hum that made the teeth ache. The cups on Grendel's table rattled, a discordant chorus against his booming voice. "Rust rot!" one of Grendel's men cursed, steadying a monitor. "Another tremor tide! Getting worse!"
Grendel waved a dismissive hand. "The old girl groans, but she holds. The Spire-born panic, we profit, deep and safe." But this was different. The hum didn't fade. It intensified, growing into a monstrous, grinding groan that vibrated in the air, in the water, in Jorin's bones. It was the sound of a god clearing its throat. Then came the screech, a high, piercing shriek of metal on metal, a sound that spoke of pressures beyond comprehension, of forces that could peel amphitrite open like a tin can. Dust and flakes of rust rained down from the ceiling. "What is that?" Grendel snapped, his celebratory mood instantly evaporating. The grin fell from his face, replaced by the hard-edged paranoia of a man whose control was absolute only when the variables were known. The screech was joined by a second, then a third, coming from different directions. It was a symphony of structural failure, coordinated and deliberate. As the sound clawed at the air, something tore through Jorin. It wasn't a sound, it was a sensation. A white-hot spike of agony shot from the base of his spine to the nape of his neck. He gasped, dropping his water bulb. It hit the deck plating with a dull thud. He felt immense weight, a crushing, tectonic pressure. It wasn't in the room, it was in him. His own skeleton seemed to cry out, his ribs grinding against his lungs, his joints screaming as if they were being forced past their breaking point. In the cascading chaos of his mind, the whispers of the drowned were momentarily silenced, replaced by a blueprint of the city, ghostly and intuitive. He saw them. Massive, multi-ton pressure doors, the sector exclusion bulkheads. He saw the grinding gears, the hydraulic rams thick as ancient trees, driving meters of solid Titan steel into their housing. The screeching wasn't just a sound. It was the physical torment of the city, and he was feeling it as his own. "Get on the comms!" Grendel bellowed, pointing at a tech hunched over a flickering console. "Find out what that is, now!" Then a new sound joined the cacophony, the distant wailing cry of the citywide quarantine alarm, a sound no one had heard in a generation. It was a death knell. The lights in the hideout flickered, buzzed, and dimmed to a barely there emergency red. The cacophony of grinding reached an impossible, deafening crescendo. Jorin fell to his knees, a choked scream caught in his throat. The pain was absolute. It felt as if his entire body was being sealed, his limbs being pressed into his torso, his world collapsing into a single point of agony behind his eyes.
He felt the colossal, final impact in every cell of his being. A city-shaking, world-ending thump. A final, definitive clang that echoed for a solid, terrifying 10 seconds. And then, silence. A profound, unnatural quiet. The constant, lifelong thrum of Amphitrite's upper-level systems was gone. The alarms were gone. The grinding was gone. All that remained was the drip of water in Grendel's hideout and the frantic sound of their own breathing. Jorin's pain receded, leaving behind a hollow, phantom ache, a deep, thrumming awareness. He could feel them, the sealed bulkheads. They weren't just metal doors in the distance, they were scars, fresh, raw wounds branded onto his newfound sensory map of the city. He could feel the unyielding pressure against them, the weight of the ocean, the dead stillness of the severed systems. Grendel's tech looked up from his console, his face pale as a tube worm in the dim red light. "Boss," he stammered, his voice thin. "Praxilla." Short pause. "She invoked the whole Integrity Act, Emergency Containment Protocol, Scylla." Grendel stood utterly still. His knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of a table. "What does that mean, Corm?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. Corv swallowed hard. "It means they've sealed us in. The whole Sump. Every access conduit, every ventilation shaft, every service tube." Short pause. "All power, water, and atmospheric feeds from the Spire severed." Medium pause. "We're on our own." For a moment, Grendel didn't react. He just stared into the gloom, a king looking out over his kingdom, which, in the space of 90 seconds, had transformed into a burgeoning empire, into a steel tomb. Then his face began to contort, the muscles in his jaw knotting. His eyes, burning with incandescent fury, found Jorin's. "Rust rot!" The roar was primal, a beast discovering the bars of its cage. He seized the heavy chrome monitor Corv had been using, and with a surge of pure, violent rage, hurled it against the far bulkhead. It exploded in a shower of sparks and fractured glass. That witch! That Spire-born witch! He began to pace, his heavy boots slamming against the deck plating. "She locked us in here, with the plague! She turned my city into a charnel house!" His men shuffled back, giving their incandescent leader a wide berth. His plans, his profits, his power, all of it was now trapped in a sealed box at the bottom of the world, left to rot. While Grendel raged, Hestian finally moved. They opened their eyes, which seemed to hold a placid, unnerving depth in the red light. They unfolded their hands and began to whisper, a soft, rhythmic chant that was barely audible beneath Grendel's fury. It was a prayer, Jorin realized, but not one of supplication. It was a prayer of welcome. Jorin pushed himself up, leaning against the cold, damp wall. The physical pain was gone, but something far worse remained. He felt the city. He felt the cage. Praxilla hadn't just trapped him. She had maimed him. The klaxon was a physical thing, a screaming red pulse that hammered against Jorin's skull. It was one more voice in the choir of the drowned, a mechanical shriek layered over the spectral whispers that were now his constant companions. His lungs burned, each breath a searing intake of ozone and metallic damp. His boots slipped on the grated floor, slick with a perpetual film of condensation and something thicker, something that clung like old oil. "Move, welder! On your left!" Grendel Brekker was a force of nature, a bull in the city's rusted arteries. He barreled past, his augmented hydraulic arm a piston of dark metal, deflecting a shower of sparks from a ruptured conduit overhead without breaking stride. The tidal lord's face was a mask of furious determination, his heavy frame a stark contrast to Jorin's lean, wiry build. Hope, Jorin realized, was a kind of violence. Grendel was radiating it. They were in Maintenance Corridor P12, a claustrophobic tube of sweating metal and tangled infrastructure deep on the Sump's perimeter. Sickly orange sodium lamps flickered erratically, casting their sprint in a strobe of amber and shadow. Wires and coolant pipes hung low, like the grasping vines of some metallic jungle. Jorin ducked under a thick bundle of cables, the cold rubber scraping his scalp. A drip of briny water traced a path down his neck.
He's drowning. The thought wasn't his. It was a shard of someone else's terror. A memory of a maintenance tech named Kalen who had died in this very corridor 5 years ago, caught by a steam pipe rupture. Jorin could feel the phantom sensation of scalding water on his skin, the desperate, futile gasp for air that wasn't superheated vapor. He shook his head, trying to clear the echo, trying to focus on the burning in his own muscles, the frantic rhythm of his own heart. "Praxilla thinks she's got us," Grendel's voice boomed, echoing down the corridor. He glanced back, his eyes wild with a manic energy. "She thinks she can just shut the door on the Sump, on us. The Spire-born have always underestimated us. They don't know the guts of this place. I do." Jorin didn't answer. He couldn't. The city was screaming in his head. Through the choral echo, he felt the immense strain on Amphitrite's superstructure. He felt the groaning shift of 1,000 tons of durasteel as the quarantine sequence rippled through the arcology's skeleton. It wasn't just a lockdown, it was an amputation. He could feel the city's nervous system being severed, bulkhead by massive bulkhead. "The secondary service hatch," Grendel shouted, pointing with his biological hand. "P13 Gamma. It's an old cargo access point, predates the new compliance protocols. It's on a separate hydraulic system, slower. We can beat it." Hope. It was such a foreign, brutal concept. Jorin hadn't felt it in years, not since he'd watched the water fill the observation dome where his daughter, Lyra, had been playing. Now Grendel was trying to inject it into him like a stimulant, and it felt like poison. They rounded a sharp bend, the air growing colder. Up ahead the corridor widened into a small staging area, and there it was. A gaping circular portal, 20 meters in diameter, currently open to a connecting passage that glowed with the cleaner, sterile blue of the mid-level districts. Freedom, bathed in cold neon. But the air thrummed with a new sound, a low, powerful hum that vibrated up through the soles of Jorin's boots. It was the sound of colossal machinery waking from a long slumber. "It's too late," a chorus of whispers sighed in his mind. "The sea always wins."
"There, see? I told you! Go, go, go!" Grendel surged forward, finding a new burst of speed. Jorin followed, his gaze locked on the opening. A part of him, a small, stupid human part, daring to believe. Then he saw it. The edges of the colossal meter-thick pressure door began to move. Not fast. It was a slow, inexorable crawl, like the closing of a leviathan's eyelid. The hydraulic pistons, each as thick as a man's torso, hissed as they engaged, gleaming with pressurized fluid under the emergency lights. "Rust, rot!" Grendel's roar was one of outrage, of a man betrayed by the very machine he claimed to have mastered. He pushed himself harder, his heavy footfalls clanging like a hammer on an anvil. Jorin felt the change in the air pressure, a subtle shift as the immense volume of the hatch began to displace the corridor's atmosphere. The hum intensified into a deep guttural groan. It was the sound of the city straining, the cry of stressed metal that he knew better than his own name. But this was different. This wasn't a groan of fatigue. It was a sound of finality. The door was halfway closed. "No!" Grendel screamed, a raw, primal sound of disbelief. He was only 30 meters away. 20. He was never going to make it. Jorin stumbled to a halt, his own frantic momentum draining away. He watched, mesmerized by the terrible slow-motion ballet of it. The gap of blue light narrowed, a dying star collapsing into a black hole. The groan of the hydraulics rose in pitch to a deafening shriek, the sound of metal screaming against its own engineered limits. For a horrifying second, Jorin didn't just hear it, he felt it inside his bones, a sympathetic vibration with the tormented steel. The voices of the echo went silent, as if they too were holding their breath. 10 meters. Grendel threw himself forward in a desperate, futile dive, his clawed hand outstretched as if he could physically hold back 10,000 tons of closing fate. The shriek climaxed. The gap vanished. It wasn't just a sound, it was a physical event, a shockwave that blasted down the corridor. It hit Jorin like a fist, throwing him back against the curved wall of the passage. The air compressed, hot and violent, before snapping back. The metal plates under his feet jumped, and for a terrifying instant, the entire corridor rang like a massive struck bell. The orange lamps flickered and died, plunging them into absolute blackness for a full 3 seconds before a single emergency strip on the ceiling sputtered to life, casting the scene in a ghostly green-gold glow, the color of bioluminescence. The boom echoed and echoed, a rolling metallic thunder that seemed to travel through the very bones of the Sump, a proclamation of their new reality. Then, just as slowly as it built, it faded, and there was silence. Not the usual silence of amphitrite, the relative quiet between the thrum of turbines and the drip of water. This was a deep, profound, and absolute stillness. The klaxons were gone. The distant shouts were gone. The hum of the larger environmental systems was gone, severed. The Sump was an island, cut off from the mainland of the city. The silence was the sound of a tomb being sealed. It was more terrifying than any noise Jorin had ever heard. He pushed himself off the wall, his ears ringing. His gaze fell on Grendel. The Tide Lord was on his hands and knees, just meters from the sealed door. He stared at the seamless surface of the durasteel, his face a canvas of utter shock. His hope hadn't just been crushed, it had been atomized. "No," Grendel breathed, the word a tiny, pathetic puff of air in the vast, dead quiet. He crawled the last few feet and pressed his forehead against the cold metal. "No!" He slammed his biological fist against the door. The sound was a dull, pathetic thump, instantly swallowed by the immense mass of the bulkhead. He hit it again and again. Each blow was a desperate punctuation mark at the end of a finished sentence. "Open, you rust-rotten pieces!"
His shouts had no echo now. They just died in the air in front of him. Jorin watched, feeling nothing but a cold, hollow certainty. He had known this was coming. The echo had told him. He looked down at his own hands, half expecting to see them shimmer with the same ghostly light he sometimes saw in the deep. They looked normal for now. He then looked back down the long, dark corridor they had just run. It was no longer a path. It was a cage. Their cage. Grendel slumped, his assault on the door dissolving into shuddering sobs of rage and despair. He was a king with no kingdom, a prisoner in his own domain. Jorin reached out and placed a hand on the cold, weeping wall beside him. And beneath the chill of the metal, beneath the film of moisture, he felt it. A faint, rhythmic hum. It wasn't the machinery of the city. It was something else. Something alive. The silence wasn't empty at all. It was listening. The wall was a wound, a festering biometallic tumor that pulsed with a faint, nauseating green-gold light. Where Grendel Brekker had been moments before, all fury and chrome and roaring ambition, there was now just a ragged seam in the bulkhead, a pulsating knot of flesh and weeping metal. Jorin stumbled backward, his boots scraping on the rusted grate of the floor. The air, thick with the usual Sump stink of ozone and recycled water, was now tainted with something else, something organic and ancient, like the floor of a forest after a century of rain. He gagged, the taste of it coating his tongue. He had to move. His legs were leaden, his joints filled with grinding sand. The echo in his head, usually a chorus of the drowned, was unnervingly quiet. It was the silence of a predator. The silence that had fallen over Grendel's rebellion, now leaderless and scattered outside the chamber. Jorin could hear their shouts, distant and confused, but they were nothing compared to the roaring void that had opened in his own mind. He looked at his hands. The pale, symbiotic glow that had flared to life during the assimilation was receding, sinking back beneath his skin. But he could still feel it. A warmth. A connection to the very metal of the city that now held what was left of Grendel Brekker.
No! The word was a choked rasp, barely his own. He tore his eyes from the wall and lurched into the adjoining corridor, a narrow, abandoned walkway that snaked through the guts of the Sump's oldest infrastructure. He didn't know where he was going. Away, just away. The walkway was a skeleton of corroded steel, lit by the sickly orange death rattle of a single sodium lamp. Wires hung like petrified vines, slick with a perpetual film of condensation. Every drip of water that echoed in the oppressive quiet sounded like a loading cartridge. He pressed a hand against the cold, weeping wall, trying to steady himself. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum against the deep foundational thrum of the city. Then the silence in his head broke. It wasn't his daughter's voice. It wasn't the fragmented death agonies of the long drowned. This was new. It started as a whisper, a faint crackle of static at the edge of his hearing. A single thought, not his own, sharp with panic. The ceiling. Is it moving? Jorin froze. He glanced up at the reinforced plates above, half expecting to see them buckling. They were solid. Unmoving. He shook his head, trying to clear it. Just nerves. Just the aftershock of what he'd just seen. He pushed himself off the wall and took another step. Then another voice. A woman's. The air feels thin. Gods, the air is getting thin. Kaelin, stay close to me. The thought was so clear, so immediate, he could almost feel the phantom weight of a small hand clutching his own. He flinched, pulling his hand back as if he'd been burned. "Get out of my head," he hissed, the words lost to the dripping and the groans of the arcology. But they weren't just in his head anymore. The choral echo, supercharged by the sheer density of life trapped in the sealed-off Sump, was reaching out. It was no longer just a passive archive of the dead. It was becoming a live network for the living, an antenna tuned to the frequency of raw primal fear. And the Sump was screaming.
What began as a few stray whispers of anxiety multiplied. They became a torrent, a flood. The low hum of the city was drowned out by a rising psychic roar. It wasn't sound, it was the feeling of 1,000 fingernails scraping on the inside of his skull. The terror of every single soul trapped in the sump, every hull clinger in their cramped container hab, every sump rat in the ventilation gills was pouring directly into him. He stumbled, catching himself on a rusted railing. The cold, wet metal felt like a live wire. A jolt shot up his arm, and with it a vision, not a memory, but a live feed of another man's panic. He was in a tiny claustrophobic maintenance locker, the walls groaning with the pressure of the deep. He convinced the plates were about to implode, that he was about to be turned to red paste in an instant. Jorin felt his own chest constrict, the phantom pressure squeezing the air from his lungs. He gasped, the vision shattering. He pushed himself onward, his walk a frantic stagger. The roar intensified. It was a cacophony of fear, a symphony of despair played on the instrument of his own mind. The water. Is the water safe? They said it was clean, but they're not coming back for us. They locked the doors and they're never coming back. I can't breathe. Oh gods, I can't. He was drowning in them. He clutched his temples, knuckles white as if he could physically stop the thoughts from getting in. A wave of sensory data crashed over him, the smell of burning insulation from a shorting circuit in Sector GAMMA 9, the taste of synthetic nutrient paste, thin and acrid in a woman's mouth 3 levels down, the feeling of being crushed, not by water, but by a stampeding mob in a central concourse, the hot panicked breath of strangers on his neck, the weight of bodies pressing in, pinning his arms. "Stop," he pleaded to the empty corridor, his voice a fragile thread against the hurricane in his mind. "Stop!" The bioluminescent fungi clinging to the walls seemed to pulse with the onslaught, their ghostly green-gold light flickering in time with the waves of terror. The collective psychic scream was a physical force. It pushed him, battered him. He tripped over a loose bundle of cabling, his legs giving out completely. He didn't have time to even throw his hands out. He hit the grated floor with a sickening clang of bone against steel. He lay there, gasping on the cold, wet metal. The world outside his own mind had ceased to exist. There was only the storm. He was on his knees now, head bowed as the visions came in a rapid, strobing montage. A child's face, streaked with tears, looking up at a flickering light. An old man's hands gnarled and shaking, trying and failing to pry open a sealed hatch. A security officer's view, looking out at a sea of desperate faces turning into a riot. Fear of the dark, fear of starvation, fear of suffocation, fear of being forgotten, fear of the deep, fear, fear, fear. It was too much. The sheer, unadulterated volume of it all was shredding his consciousness. His identity, the ghost of Jorin that still clung to the memory of his daughter, was a single drop of rain in a tidal wave. He could feel himself dissolving, his own specific dread lost in the ocean of everyone else's. His vision began to white out, not from a lack of light, but from a surplus of information. His neurons were firing, overloaded, burning out. His last coherent thought was not a thought at all, but a final, chilling realization. The echo wasn't a parasite feeding on him. He was the echo. And the body of the god was the collective soul of a city that had just been buried alive. The screaming in his mind didn't stop. He just stopped hearing it. His body went limp, collapsing fully onto the grate, a silent, unmoving vessel in the middle of an abandoned walkway, containing all the noise of a world ending. The only sound left was the slow, rhythmic drip of water onto still metal.
The abandoned walkway was a dead nerve in the Sump's gangrenous flesh. Here, the thrum of the geothermal turbines was a distant, hollow ache, muffled by layers of corroded decking and weeping insulation. The air, thick with the sharp tang of ozone and rust, carried the faintest briny scent of a nearby reclamation pipe leak. A single sodium vapor lamp at the far end of the corridor sputtered, casting a sickly orange light that made the slick, black mold on the bulkheads seem to breathe. Grendel Brekker found Jorin here, crumpled at the base of a wall webbed with inert, moss-like fungus.
Jorin was a marionette whose strings had been cut. He lay half-curled on the grated floor, his body jerking in small, spastic tremors. His eyes were open, wide and staring, but they saw nothing in this rust-eaten corridor. They were fixed on a horizon of drowning ghosts only he could see. A faint, greenish-gold light pulsed beneath the skin of his forearms, synchronized with the rhythmic twitch of his fingers. "Rust rot," Grendel grunted, the sound sharp and angry in the relative quiet. The servo motors in his heavy hydraulic claw, a salvaged piece of industrial machinery grafted to his left arm, whined softly as he flexed the polished steel pincers. Impatience radiated from him like heat. His people, his tide lords and the desperate hole-clingers he'd rallied, were waiting for him to deliver on his promise, a way out. He stumped closer, his heavy work boots clanging against the metal grating. "Jorin, on your feet!" There was no response, only another violent shudder that ran through Jorin's frame. Grendel's face, a mask of hard lines and pragmatic fury, tightened. "We don't have time for this," he snarled, more to himself than to the man on the floor. He bent down, his good hand grabbing a fistful of Jorin's damp jumpsuit. He hauled. Jorin's body was dead weight, his head lolling back, the tendons in his neck standing out like taut wires. "Come on, welder!" Grendel shouted, his voice echoing down the walkway. He gave Jorin a rough shake. "The abyss gave you a gift, a key. That bulkhead Praxilla dropped on us has a weak point. I know it. You can feel it. You just need to show me where." Jorin's lips parted, and a sound came out. Not a word, but a wet, garbled whisper, the sound of waterlogged comm static. His eyes, for a fleeting second, seemed to focus on Grendel, but they were filled with an alien terror, the pressure of 1,000 fathoms. "He cannot hear you, Tide Lord." The voice was a low hum, emerging from the deeper shadows near the sputtering lamp. Grendel spun around, dropping Jorin's limp body back to the grated floor with a thud. His claw rose instinctively, the hydraulic pump kicking in with a higher-pitched whine. Hestian stepped into the weak orange light.
The Sump rat was a stark contrast to Grendel's brutalist form. He was thin, wiry, wrapped in layers of patched, earth-toned rags that blended with the decay of the lower levels. His face was gaunt, but his eyes were luminous, holding a serene, unwavering intensity. He moved with a liquid grace that made no sound.
"Stay out of this, mystic," Grendel warned, the tips of his metal claws scraping lightly against each other. "This is business for men who still have their feet on the deck." Hestian glided forward, placing himself between Grendel and Jorin's twitching form. He didn't seem to notice the massive weaponized appendage aimed at his chest. "You see a tool you can use to batter down a door?" he said, his voice calm, almost melodic. "I see a man being reborn. You are interrupting the baptism." Grendel let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Baptism? He's having a fit. He's broken, Hestian. But he's a broken tool I can still use. His affliction lets him see the city's bones. He'll find a stress fracture, a weak weld, a corroded seal in that quarantine gate. He will get us out. He will, Hestian agreed, nodding slowly. But not for you, not as your weapon. He knelt beside Jorin, his long, slender fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair from the welder's sweat-soaked forehead. The faint bioluminescence in Jorin's skin seemed to brighten at his touch. The echo protects its own. It is a consciousness, Grendel, a new kind of life. You cannot force a tide to break where you wish. You can only learn to swim in it. The Tide Lord's patience, already worn thin, snapped. Swim? We are starving in here. The water recyclers are failing. The air scrubbers are on emergency power. My people are looking at me, expecting me to save them, not to hum prayers with a fungus eater while our only hope lies spasming on the floor. He lunged forward, pushing past Hestian to grab Jorin again. Get up! This time, Hestian's hand shot out, grabbing Grendel's wrist with surprising strength. His grip was like iron wire. No. The word was soft, but absolute. It hung in the air, heavier than the pressure of the ocean outside.
Let go, Grendel said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. The motors on his claw spun up, the pincers opening and closing in a menacing threat display. Or I will make you. You will try, Hestian replied, his expression unchanging. You seek to use the voice of the deep as a battering ram. You are a blind man swinging a hammer in a room made of glass. He is not a key, Grendel. He is becoming the door to something new, something you cannot control. The standoff was absolute. The Tidal Lord and the Prophet, the man of brute force and the man of quiet faith. Their fragile alliance, born of mutual desperation in the face of Praxilla's quarantine, shattered in that silent, dripping corridor. Grendel saw it then. He saw the chasm that had opened between them. Hestian wasn't an ally. He was a guard, a priest protecting a sacred vessel from desecration. And Jorin was the vessel. With a final disgusted curse, Grendel ripped his arm free from Hestian's grasp. He took a step back, his hydraulic claw lowering slightly. He had no time for this, no time for a protracted fight over a broken man when his rebellion was waiting for its king to lead them. Fine, he spat, venom dripping from the word. Keep your prophet, pray to him, anoint him with your precious rust and glimmermoth. But when the lights go out for good, when my people are tearing each other apart for the last Russian pack, we'll see how much your faith is worth. He turned on his heel, his heavy boots echoing his fury as he stomped away, the whining motors of his claw, a promise of violence deferred. He disappeared back into the warren of the Sump, a storm of pure, unresolved force. Hestian watched him go, his serene expression finally flickering with a trace of concern. He turned back to Jorin, who was now shivering, the tremors lessening. The whispers from his lips were becoming clearer now. Not words, but names, locations, pressures, a litany of the dying city's pain. Hestian knelt, placing a gentle hand on Jorin's shoulder.
The golden-green light in the welder's arms pulsed, a faint echo of the city's hidden, living heart. "Be still," Hestian murmured, his voice a balm against the storm raging inside Jorin's head. "The change is almost complete. They cannot use you. We are one."
The broadcast studio in the Spire was a void. Sound did not exist here, not in the way it did in the lower city. There was no groaning of stressed metal, no constant drip of condensation, no distant percussive clang of a dropped wrench echoing through kilometers of steel. Here, the air was a dead, sterile thing, tasting faintly of ozone and polished surfaces. It was the absolute silence of the abyss, but tamed, caged, and weaponized. The only sound was the thrum of Praxilavar's own blood in her ears. She sat before a black, monolithic camera lens, its unblinking eye absorbing all light. Behind it, a technician in a sterile gray uniform held up a hand, fingers splayed. 5 seconds. Praxilla took a breath, not of air, but of the calculated silence. She let it fill her. The comms panel on the brushed steel console before her was a constellation of muted green lights, representing every district, every hab block, every public address system in Amphitrite, all except one section, now dark, a void within the void, the Sump. 3. She straightened her spine. Her compliance officer uniform was immaculate, its sharp lines and obsidian black fabric a stark contrast to the theoretical rust and decay she was about to discuss. 2. She composed her face, dialing down the hard edges of her authority into a mask of solemn gravity, a surgeon's focus tinged with a surgeon's necessary regret. 1. The red light on the camera blinked to life, a silent signal that she was now speaking into every ear in the city.
Her eyes, a pale, piercing gray, stared directly into the lens. She imagined the faces staring back from their cramped habs, from the mess halls, from the flickering monitors in engineering bays. She pictured their fear, their pressure paranoia, a cultural bedrock she was now about to quarry. For several weeks, the Triarch Council has been monitoring a threat, an enemy we cannot see, a biological corruption that found its way into our foundations, a contamination that moves through water, through metal, through the very bones of our home. Internally, she felt a flicker of contempt. Coral echo. They gave it a name, a mystique. She refused. To name it was to grant it power. It was a pathogen, a biological error, nothing more. Our best minds in sustenance and engineering worked tirelessly to contain it. But this agent is aggressive. It is adaptive, and it has breached our primary reclamation systems. She paused, letting the implication land. It was in the water. She saw the panic she was seeding, and she cultivated it. Despite our best efforts, the infection found a foothold, a place to fester, a place to grow beyond our reach, beyond any hope of sterilization, without compromising the entire city's life support. Her expression shifted. The sober authority was now alloyed with pain. It was a masterful performance. That place was the Sump. Another pause. She had to give them a moment to absorb the damnation of an entire district, to turn thousands of their fellow citizens into a narrative abstraction, a necessary loss. The Sump is the heart of our industry. Its people are the bedrock upon which our city stands. The welders, the technicians, the farmers, they are our friends, our family. The words felt like ash in her mouth, but she delivered them with perfect, sorrowful sincerity. which is why this is the most difficult address I have ever had to make." Now for the turn, the shift from regret to resolve. Her voice hardened, losing its somber edge and gaining the sharp, righteous conviction of a judge passing sentence. A cancer left unchecked will kill the body. An infection allowed to spread will turn the whole of the whole into a tomb. We were faced with an impossible choice: to watch our entire world sicken and die, or to make a sacrifice, to excise the corrupted part, for the good of the whole.
Her gaze was unwavering. "An hour ago I signed the order to enact the Hull Integrity Act. The Sump district has been isolated. The pressure bulkheads have been permanently sealed. All water, power, and environmental conduits have been severed." She did not say she had condemned them to a slow death in the dark. She did not say they would turn on each other, driven mad by thirst and the accelerating infection. She did not say she had just executed thousands to secure a political power base. She said isolated, a clean, clinical, necessary word. This was not a failure of will. This was an act of survival, a terrible, necessary act to ensure that Amphitrite itself endures, to ensure that our children have a future. We will mourn the loss of the Sump. We will honor their sacrifice. Their memory will be forged into the very spirit of this city, a permanent reminder of the price of survival. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a near whisper laced with steel. "But we will survive. This city will not fall. The corruption will be contained. The line has been drawn." She leaned back, her face a mask of grim determination. "From this moment forward, we are a city at war. New protocols will be in effect. Compliance officers will be conducting health screenings. There will be rationing. There will be hardship. But there will also be unity. For the Hull is the whole, now and forever. Deep and safe." The red light on the camera went out. The broadcast was over. Praxilla held her position for a 3 count. Then the mask of the righteous Savior dissolved as if it had never been. Her face went slack, utterly devoid of emotion. The technician, a young man with wide, disturbed eyes, swallowed hard. "Ma'am, is there anything else?" She didn't look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the dark comms panel, the section representing the Sump. It wasn't a memorial to her. It was a checklist item, completed. "No," she said, her voice stripped of all performance, flat and cold as the abyssal plain. The voices shredded the air behind him. Grendel's grating roar about weapons and weakness, Hestian's serene, maddening insistence on acceptance. Jorin turned his back on them, the sound of their argument dissolving into the Sump's oppressive symphony, the deep frequency thrum of the distant turbines, the wet slap of condensation on pitted steel, the endless groaning complaint of a city under siege by an ocean. He needed to get away. The space between his temples felt tight, a band of pressure that had nothing to do with the kilometers of water above his head. He moved without a destination, his heavy mag boots clanking on the grated floor of the service corridor. The orange glow of the sodium vapor lamps painted everything in shades of rust and decay. Wires, thick as a man's arm, hung from the low ceiling like dead vines, weeping a thin, slick fluid that smelled of ozone and brine. He wanted silence. The kind of silence he hadn't known since before the breach, before the screaming water had taken Elara. But the silence wouldn't come, not from the outside and certainly not from within. Instead, another noise was rising to take the place of Grendel's shouting. It wasn't a sound, not really. It was a feeling, an itch. It started as a faint dissonance in the deep hum of the arcology, a single sour note in a familiar chord. But now, with every step he took away from the others, it grew more specific, more localized. A phantom ache, not in his body, but in the body of the city itself. It felt like a bone set wrong, a nerve pinched somewhere deep in Amphitrite's iron skeleton. It was a structural wrongness, a flaw that sang to the echo in his blood. He followed it. He had no choice. The compulsion was a physical pull, a nagging insistence that vibrated just behind his eyes. He veered from the main corridor into a narrower maintenance tunnel, one marked with a faded, almost illegible stencil, Auxiliary Conduit 7B. No one used these routes anymore. The air grew thicker, heavier, saturated with the smell of stagnant water and ancient mold. Bioluminescent fungi clung to the bulkheads in pale, ghostly patches, their green-gold light shimmering on the perpetual dampness of the walls. His lightstick cut a sharp, white beam through the gloom, illuminating a ladder that descended into a sublevel. The itch was stronger down there, a high-frequency throb that seemed to travel up the rungs into his palms. He descended, the sound of his own breathing loud in the confined space. At the bottom, the floor wasn't grated steel, but poured permacrete, cracked and uneven. A shallow layer of dark water sloshed around his boots with every step. This place was old, first-generation construction, forgotten. The itch was an insistent spike now, centered just ahead. He rounded a corner where a bank of electrical junctions had failed spectacularly years ago, their insides a charred mess of melted copper and blackened ceramic. And there, against the far wall, he saw it, the source of the discord. A Series 4 sub-basin recirculator. It was a behemoth of rust and verdigris, a relic from the city's earliest days. It shouldn't have been working. Its power conduit was frayed, and the housing was streaked with decades of corrosion. Yet a single green indicator light blinked with stubborn life on its control panel, and a low rhythmic thump, clank, vibrated through the floor. It was active. Why? Auxiliary pumps like this were only supposed to engage under specific emergency conditions, catastrophic pressure loss in the primary system. Praxilla's lockdown. The thought hit him with the force of a physical blow. When she'd slammed the bulkheads shut and severed the Sump's main water lines, she'd created the exact condition needed to trigger this ancient, forgotten protocol. The system, in its dumb mechanical way, was trying to save itself. It was trying to keep the pipes from running dry. His gaze followed the pump's primary intake, a massive, meter-wide pipe that plunged straight down through the floor. It didn't connect to the main reclamation system. The echo in his head supplied the knowledge without his asking, feeding him a blueprint he'd never seen. This pipe didn't draw from the filtered, treated water of the upper levels. It drew from the Sump's emergency reservoir, the dregs, the absolute bottom of the barrel. He moved toward a maintenance railing that overlooked the reservoir itself, a huge black cistern carved out of the arcology's foundation. The air temperature dropped. The stench of decay intensified, mingled with something else, something cloyingly sweet. He shone his light down into the abyss. The beam was swallowed by an unnatural, viscous darkness. The water wasn't just water. It was perfectly still, like a plate of obsidian, and it was thick with something that clung to the light, refusing to reflect it properly. Then he saw it, a faint, internal shimmer, not on the surface, but within the water, a slow, swirling nebula of ghostly green-gold luminescence, the coral echo, but not as he'd ever seen it, not as trace particles. This was a concentrated, thriving colony, a primordial soup of archived souls left to fester and grow in the dark for decades. The pump kicked into a new cycle. The thump-clank intensified, and he felt the shudder run through the deck. He watched, mesmerized, in horror, as the still surface of the reservoir dimpled. A slow-moving whirlpool formed, directly above the intake pipe's submerged maw. The shimmering lights of the echo spiraled downward, drawn into the pump like stardust into a black hole. He understood. He understood with a clarity so perfect, so sickening, it made him want to vomit. The lockdown hadn't stopped the infection. It hadn't even slowed it. It had weaponized it. Praxilla had cut the sump off from the clean water, and this forgotten machine had automatically switched to the most contaminated source in the entire city. It was pumping a pure, unfiltered, highly concentrated dose of the coral echo directly into the sump's remaining circulation. The taps in the hab units, the communal showers, the nutrient paste synthesizers, every single point of access was now a fire hose of raw, undiluted infection. They weren't just quarantined, they were being force-fed the abyss. "It's an incubator," he breathed, the words lost in the rhythmic thunder of the pump. The thought was not entirely his own. It was a cold, analytical observation supplied by the chorus in his head. The sump wasn't a prison. It was a farm, a nursery designed to accelerate the echo's growth, to bring it to a critical mass.
The itch in his mind vanished, replaced by the crushing weight of this new knowledge. Grendel's rebellion, Hestian's peace, none of it mattered. They were all just bacteria in a petri dish, arguing about the nature of the glass while the poison flooded in. The madness, the visions, the fear gripping the sump, that was just the beginning. Soon there would be no individuals left to be mad. There would only be the tide. The air in Grendel's makeshift command center was thick enough to chew. It tasted of ozone, rust, and the hot metal stink of overclocked machinery. Dozens of bodies were crammed into the cavernous salvage bay, their collective sweat adding a briny slickness to the atmosphere. Jorin stood near the back, his shoulders pressed against a weeping bulkhead, feeling the city's ceaseless, deep-frequency thrum travel up his spine. It was a familiar feeling, the groan of a world perpetually on the verge of collapse. But tonight, another vibration layered over it, the low, angry hum of a mob finding its voice. On a platform of stacked ration crates, Grendel Brekker stood bathed in the sickly orange glow of a single sodium vapor lamp. The Tide Lord was built like a pressure door, wide, solid, immovable. One of his arms was a thing of salvaged hydraulics, a heavy-duty manipulator claw that rested on his hip like a sheathed weapon. He scanned the crowd of hull clingers and his own loyal Tide Lords, his face a mask of grim certainty. "They sealed us in!" Grendel's voice boomed, cutting through the murmurs. It was a voice used to being obeyed over the shriek of failing turbines. "The Spire-born cut the power. They cut the water. They left us here to rot with the sick." A roar of agreement went up, a wave of sound that vibrated in Jorin's bones. He saw the fear in their faces, the raw, primal terror of being trapped. Grendel let the noise swell before raising a hand. Praxilavar calls this a quarantine, a health protocol. I call it an execution." He leaned forward, the work lamp carving deep shadows into his face. "They think the Sump is a diseased limb, something to be amputated. But they've forgotten something. We are the ones who keep the blood pumping. We are the ones who hold the darkness at bay. The whole is the whole? Fine, then we are the heart of it, and a body can't live without its heart."
Another cheer, this one more defiant. Jorin felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. He had given Grendel the information, the specific pipe junctions and power conduits that Praxilla's forces would target first. He had used the Echo's whispers, the fragmented knowledge of dead engineers, to help the Tide Lords secure this district. He had told himself it was for survival. Now, watching Grendel twist that survival into a call for war, he felt the acid tang of complicity.
"But we have a disease among us," Grendel continued, his voice dropping. "Not just Praxilla's paranoia, a real one. You've seen them, the Echo-touched, staring at the walls, whispering to the damp. They are weak, compromised. The Echo, it doesn't just make you sick, it makes you a liability. It turns you into a doorway for the abyss to seep through." Jorin's hands clenched. The whispers in his own mind, usually a chaotic storm, swirled into a single cold point. "He means you." The image of his daughter, Lyanna, flickered behind his eyes, her small hand slipping from his grasp in the rushing water. The memory was sharp, his own, for now. "We can't afford liabilities," Grendel declared. His hydraulic claw whirred, the metal fingers clenching into a fist. "We don't cower. We don't pray. We fight. We take back our home. First we cleanse it. Anyone showing the signs, anyone who sides with the sickness, is an enemy of the Sump, an enemy of the living." His lieutenants began moving through the crowd, handing out weapons that weren't weapons. Heavy-gauge pipe wrenches, pneumatic rivet guns that hissed like angry serpents, plasma cutters with their power cells freshly charged, tools of maintenance repurposed for war. A man near Jorin took a wrench, his knuckles white, his eyes wide with a terrifying mix of fear and fervor. This is madness, Jorin thought. Grendel was creating a crusade, pointing the Sump's terror inward. He was building an army on a foundation of prejudice, turning neighbor against neighbor. Disgusted, Jorin pushed himself off the wall. He couldn't breathe in here. He slipped through the crush of bodies unnoticed and escaped into the metallic corridors of the Sump.
The angry shouts of Grendel's new army faded behind him, replaced by the familiar sounds of the deep, the steady drip, drip, drip of condensation from a ceiling pipe, the distant groan of shifting metal, the hum of life support on its last legs. But a new sound was missing, the frantic, panicked screaming of the newly quarantined. The chaos had begun to organize. Jorin walked without a destination, his feet carrying him through the maze of walkways and ladders. The whispers were agitated now, a chorus of drowning voices arguing in his head. "He will kill us. He will kill us all." But another voice, a calmer one he barely recognized, urged him forward, a memory that wasn't his, of a place of peace, a derelict hydroponics bay, section GAMMA7, Hestian's place. He found it an hour later. The pressure door was forced open, its edges scarred with rust. But where Grendel's hideout was a pocket of heat and noise,
This place was an oasis of profound quiet. The air was cool and smelled of damp soil, algae, and something else, something clean. Old, sterile blue grow lamps cast long skeletal shadows from the rows of dead hydroponic trays, but the primary illumination came from the walls themselves. Patches of bioluminescent fungi, cultivated and cared for, pulsed with a gentle green-gold light like 1,000 captive stars. It was beautiful, and it was full of the sick. Dozens of people were here, the ones Grendel had just condemned. An old woman sat cross-legged, her eyes closed, a faint blue light glowing beneath the thin skin of her throat. A young couple held each other, the same ethereal light moving in shifting patterns on their arms, connecting them. They weren't screaming, they weren't moaning, they were still, waiting. At the center of the bay, Hestian knelt by a large filtration tank, his hands submerged in the water. Phosphorescent moss grew in a perfect circle around the tank, its glow mirroring the light that seemed to emanate from Hestian himself. He was thin, wiry, with the pale, translucent skin of a true Sump rat who had never seen a daylight simulation. He looked up as Jorin approached, his eyes a startling, clear blue. "He is making them afraid," Hestian said. His voice was soft, yet it carried perfectly in the quiet space. It wasn't a question. Grendel builds a wall of iron. He thinks it will keep the ocean out.
He's building an army, Jorin corrected, his own voice sounding harsh and loud here. He's going to purge the Sump. Purge? Hestian smiled, a sad, knowing expression. He pulled his hands from the water. They glowed faintly. How can you purge the ocean from the water? The echo isn't a disease, Welder. It's a message, a memory. The city groans because it's a machine, and machines break. It is rigid and alone. He gestured to the quiet people around them. The echo offers another way, not iron, but water. It doesn't break. It flows. It connects. Jorin stared at the faces in the ghostly light. He saw fear, yes, but underneath it was a strange serenity, an acceptance that chilled him to his core. It looked too much like giving up. It looked like drowning. "Connects us to what?" Jorin asked, the words raw. "To death? I hear them, the voices. I feel them die, over and over." "You are fighting it," Hestian said simply. "You believe your memories are a fortress, but they are a cage. The echo isn't taking them. It is asking you to share them, to join the tide." He looked directly at Jorin, his gaze piercing. "The whole is the whole. We have been told that our whole lives, but we've been wrong. The whole is the water, and we are all, finally, returning to it." Jorin felt a wave of vertigo. For a dizzying second, the whispers in his head fell silent. Hestian's words settled in that silence, not as a threat, but as a promise. The promise of peace. The promise of an end to the guilt, the pain, the ghost of his daughter. All he had to do was let go. All he had to do was drown. The thought was so terrifying and so tempting that he stumbled back a step. No, not yet. He turned and left without another word, leaving the silent sanctuary of the damned and the saved behind. As he stepped back into the main concourse, a new sound reached him from the direction of Grendel's Bay.
It was the rhythmic clang of metal on metal, a marching beat, an army preparing. From the other direction, from Hestian's hydroponics bay, there was only a profound and growing silence. 2 banners had been raised in the dark heart of the Sump, one of iron and fire, the other of water and light, and Jorin, a ghost caught between worlds, was standing directly on the battle line.
The silence was the worst part. It pressed in, a physical weight that replaced the sudden, aborted violence of Grendel's rebellion. Below the high walkway, the scattered knots of his followers had dissolved into the Sump's grimy latticework, their torches and defiant shouts extinguished. The only sound was the familiar constant thrum of Amphitrite, the deep frequency groan of a city under siege by the sea. But now another sound wove through it. A hum, not from turbines or pumps, but from the wall beside him. The wall where Grendel had ceased to exist. It wasn't a wall anymore. It was a tumor of rust-pocked metal and biomineralized flesh, pulsating with a soft green-gold light. The light throbbed in time with a rhythm Jorin could feel in the fillings of his teeth. Strands of Grendel's coveralls were woven into the mass, a patch of faded gray fabric next to a shimmering, newly grown tube worm. His hydraulic claw, the symbol of his brutal authority, was half submerged in the metallic pulp, its joints frozen, its power source long dead. The echo hadn't torn Grendel apart. It had incorporated him, filed him away, a Tide Lord reduced to a footnote in a living wall. Horror was a cold, sharp thing, but this was different. This was a vast, empty dread that settled in his bones. Jorin stumbled back, his boots scuffing on the grated floor. He looked down at his own hands. They were glowing. Not just the faint shimmer he'd grown used to, but a brilliant, steady luminescence, the same ghostly green gold as the wall. The light traced the web of veins on his skin, turning them into a map of some alien geography. They weren't his hands anymore. They were lanterns, lit from within by a silent, screaming choir. We are one. The thought wasn't his. It slid into his mind with the cold, frictionless ease of water seeping through a cracked seal. It wasn't a voice. It was a feeling of consensus, a truth statement from the burgeoning intelligence that now owned a piece of him. It had acted. It had protected its host. Not Jorin, the man, but Jorin, the vessel. The most potent node of its consciousness in this sealed-off world.
He clutched his glowing fingers, the light spilling between them, and forced himself to the edge of the walkway. His knuckles were white against the cold, damp railing. He looked down upon the Sump, his home. From up here, it was a wounded animal. The primary work lamps cast their sickly orange glare over the main thoroughfares, but the smaller residential pods and access corridors were falling into shadow as secondary power grids failed. A district dying by inches. Grendel's way was death, an ideology of force and control, a belief that the abyss had given him a gift to be wielded like a hammer, and the gift had unmade him. Hestian's way was acceptance, a passive surrender to the inevitable tide, a hope for peaceful symbiosis. But Hestian was gone, captured and likely vivisected by compliance, his gentle philosophy no defense against a scalpel. And then there was Praxilla. Her creed was order, purity. The hall is the whole. In ideology so rigid it had severed a limb to stop a fever, damning the limb to a death far worse than amputation.
3 failed ideas, 3 dead ends, and he was standing in the middle, ideologically and physically alone. The thrumming grew louder. Not the city, not the wall. This was a new vibration, coming from deep below. Jorin closed his eyes, his new senses mapping the infrastructure around him with sickening clarity. He could feel it. The primary water reclamation pump for Sector Gamma 9, the heart of the Sump's closed-loop life support. It was cycling, pushing contaminated water through thousands of meters of pipe. The whispers started then. They weren't the familiar layered echoes of the long drowned, the ghostly archive he carried from his dives to the taps. These were different. They were thin, frightened, new, whispering. The lights are flickering again, rust-rotted. Whispering. Mila? Did you lock the door? I heard. Whispering. Just a headache. It'll pass. Whispering. I'm so thirsty.
Jorin's breath hitched. A cold sweat beaded on his brow, mingling with the perpetual damp. He could hear them, hundreds of them, his neighbors, the men and women he stood with in ration queues, the faces he passed in the corridors, the families living in the repurposed cargo containers stacked like coffins. He was hearing their thoughts as the echo, carried in the water they were drinking, touched their minds for the very first time. He was listening to the precise moment their consciousness began to fray. A woman in Pod 7B suddenly forgot her daughter's name, staring at a holopic with a sense of vague, anxious curiosity. A maintenance worker in the Whispering Gills felt a phantom pressure in his lungs, the memory of a drowning man from a century ago. A child, crying for a drink, took a sip of a recycled water and suddenly grew quiet, his eyes wide with the sight of abyssal plains he had never seen. This wasn't a quarantine. Jorin gripped the railing, his glowing knuckles a beacon in the gloom. This was an experiment, a laboratory. Praxilla hadn't just sealed them in to die. She had sealed them in a petri dish with a hungry culture, and now she was watching through a microscope of sensor arrays and vital sign monitors to see what would grow. He was the control group, the first specimen already matured, and now he was forced to bear witness to the mass cultivation of the rest. The weight of the ocean above felt immense, a crushing, final pressure, but it was nothing compared to the weight of this knowledge. He was alone, so profoundly, completely alone, trapped in a cage with thousands of people who didn't yet know they were already ghosts. He was the only inmate who understood the nature of the prison, the only one who could hear the rising symphony of its own dissolution. He looked down at the Sump, no longer seeing a district of steel and despair, but a vast neural network coming online. Every pipe a dendrite, every cistern a ganglion, every unsuspecting person a new synapse firing in terror and confusion. The deep, city-wide thrum seemed to fade, replaced by the collective, internal hum of the echo. It was no longer just in his head, it was everywhere. He was a part of it, a conscious, horrified nerve ending in a body that was just beginning to awaken. And it was hungry.